Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and outside it's October. Beautiful fall weather, crisp air. The leaves are starting to come off the trees. It is so beautiful. It makes me think about cooking in a coffin. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So, cooking in a coffin. That sounds really creepy, doesn't it? So sometimes when you're reading in 18th century cookbooks, you'll find just strange terms that just pop out and you have to dig deeper. And cooking in a coffin or baking in a coffin shows up in multiple different English cookery cookbooks from the 18th century. Sometimes they don't talk about it for very much. They just kind of mention it and run away. And you're like, okay, wait a minute, stop, explain this to me. So you have to dig deeper. In context, in the 18th century cookbooks, sometimes they'll say, put this in the crust or in your coffin. So we know it's something, it's usually in the reference to a pie or something pie-like. If we really want to understand this coffin term, then we have to go back further in the 17th century. Now, obviously, they don't mean a coffin that you're, a wooden box you're going to be burying somebody in. They mean something completely different. Gervase Markham, The Well-Kept Kitchen, 1615. This is early 17th century. And he really gets into this concept of baking in a standing crust. And that is what a coffin is. This is a standing crust that you're going to be baking in instead of having a pie pan with just a simple crust inside of it. This is a sturdy crust made as its own meat preservation or preservation box that you both bake in and store food in. So it turns out that coffins are not one size fits all, or in this case, you don't use the same kind of coffin for everything you want to bake in. So if you've got a huge haunch of venison, and the problem with a huge haunch of venison is you might bring that to the table for an entire week or 3 or 4 days. To bake something huge like that, you have to have a large cooking vessel, and it has to be able to protect this for these 3 or 4 days. So for a very large cut of meat, they would make a coffin, a very large cooking vessel, out of very thick paste. And this paste would be something inexpensive. You're not going to eat it. So they would use rye flour and maybe something like suet or lard to make this really tough paste. If you're going to be cooking something that's a little bit smaller, say a turkey, maybe that's going to come to the table 2 or 3 times. It doesn't have to be as tough or as large. It doesn't have to hold up itself. So it might not be as thick, 1/2 inch thick, and you will use a wheat paste. And there's a third style where we want to be doing something fancy for a dessert, and we want to make it a special shape, because not only were these caskets nice because you could make a very, very sturdy box, but you could also decorate them and make them look very presentable for special occasions. So they would make, for desserts, a special kind of paste, maybe for a tart. In our case, we're going to be making a beautiful chocolate tart in a specially shaped little coffin for dessert. With our normal pie crust of today, we want a light and fluffy pie crust. And the secret to a light and fluffy pie crust is putting your butter into your flour cold, chilled. You want to make sure to mix it into your flour with the least amount of water and with this cold butter, and then it makes this light and fluffy pie crust. What we want here is just the opposite of that. We want a tough pie crust, so we're going to do just the opposite. We are going to mix 8 ounces of butter with an equal quantity of water, and we're going to boil it. And then we're going to pour that onto our flour, and that's going to make a very tough pie crust. And that's the whole point. We don't want what's in our coffin to rot, do we? So we've taken our boiled butter in the water and just poured that mixture right into our flour and mixed it. And while this is still warm, I'm gonna put in our egg. The egg helps stiffen it up. The egg isn't used in some of the other ones. It's just in these sort of fancier pastes that the egg gets put in here. And that's to help stiffen this particular style of dough. While I'm mixing it here for a few minutes, let's talk about this term coffin or casket. We generally use both of those terms to mean just one thing, and that is the box that you bury people in. But that's not true in the 17th century. One of the reasons why they used it in cooking was because coffin was a generic term for a box. You might have a small box on your table that you keep your important documents on, and you would call that a casket, or you would call that a coffin. So in the case of this, where we're cooking in that, we're just cooking in a box. That's all that really means. And we're making this particular box out of pastry dough. Okay, this is looking great. It's still very pliable. It's just slightly cooled off. I've rolled this out into 1/4 of an inch thick paste. I'm gonna let this set for just a second, and we're gonna cut out the shapes we'll use to build whatever coffin or container we want to later. But I wanted to read to you about the shape that I have cut this out in. And this is whimsical. This is a joke. It's a coffin in the shape of a coffin. But is that so out of the ordinary? This is Gervais's book again. A few pages later, just a few, he talks about baking a custard, which is, that's what we're going to be doing. If we skip halfway down here, it says, the interior, when you're done with that, raise your coffins of a good, tough wheat paste, being of the second sort before spoke of. If you please, raise it in pretty works or in angular forms, which you may do so by fixing the upper part of the crust to the nether with the yolks of eggs. When the coffins are ready, strew the bottoms, and then he goes on with that. He actually talks about saying, hey, if you're going to make pretty forms out of these, then this is the one to do it with. And you can cut it into angular forms. You can make it into whatever shape you wish, especially if it's a seasonal decoration, which is exactly what we've done here. We've taken this and made a coffin shape because it's October, and that's the kind of decoration that we use these days, don't we? So I thought it was kind of funny to make a coffin into a coffin shape. That's exactly what we're doing, and that's exactly what they did in the 18th century. So our pieces are done. They're set aside that we need. We can't use them right away because this dough, as it's made right now, is still very, very soft and pliable. So it has to set for 6 hours, maybe more. Overnight would be even better in a cool place, not cold, but in a cool place, and it will start to firm up, and then it will be sturdy enough for us to build whatever shape we please. So this batch I prepared earlier. It's been cooling and sort of sitting. It's really got a nice, it's still pliable enough we can work it, but it's a lot stiffer. It's probably spent about 6 hours since I made this batch. And we're just gonna put our pieces together. We already have all these cut out, basically the right size. And we're gonna use a little bit of egg yolk as our glue, just as if they were wooden parts. And this is wood glue. Well, exactly the same thing. And we could use egg white, but Markham actually says to use egg yolk. So I'm gonna follow his directions. Why not? And just go around the outside edge of the bottom of our coffin. We have our chocolate filling that's already made. Now this is a classic chocolate tart recipe from Hannah Glass's confectionery cookbook of 1800. Your standard custard with egg and cream and chocolate stirred over a slow fire. It's got spices in it too, don't forget. It gets cinnamon, it gets nutmeg. Yes, it's a beautiful filling just for this tart. We're gonna fill it up to halfway full because we want to put this little decoration on the top of that. So we get a little death's head, a little bones in here because that's, it kind of fits with this motif. Now we can put the lid on, and I'm gonna seal it just a little bit. It'll help the walls to keep them from sort of falling out and getting rounded. So that'll hold them together. And then we're gonna put a little decoration on the top of that. This is made to decorate. That's why we're doing this. So beautiful little decoration for the top lid of our coffin. Once this is set up, hey, we're gonna put a little egg wash on the outside so it browns up nicely. Then it's ready to go in the oven. Okay, this is in our oven, 350 degrees, 20, 30 minutes. We don't have to worry about the custard cooking so much. We want our coffin to look nice and start to look brown on the edges. We'll be able to tell by what it smells like and take a look. Boy, this smells great out of the oven. It looks fun. Before I try this, I want to talk about the concept of memento mori. We look at this and we might think, well, you know, this is maybe morbid. Maybe it was morbid in the 18th century. The concept of memento mori, which is remembering your mortality or remembering your death, is a very common concept in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and the motifs around death's heads and skeletons, they was very common in the imagery. They wanted to remember that they weren't going to live forever, and you might see something like this in the 18th century. So we've got that out of the way. It's time to try this out. Now, I want to try the chocolate custard first to tell you about it. If you're interested in this, making it especially, there is an episode where Ivy and I made this exact chocolate tart. You can go back and find that. It is superb as a baked custard. It is really good. Of course, we see the visuals of our crust here, but what does it actually taste like? Is it edible? Now, some of these weren't meant to be edible, but I believe this one is meant to be that way. And actually, it's got a really good texture, a really good flavor. We can even use it like a chip, I'll bet. Let's find out. So I bust off a piece here, dig it up. It's like having a cookie built in. This is so great and so fun this time of year, and very, very, really a period kind of a thing to do. You can do this other seasons, make other sorts of shapes and sizes, just exactly what they would have done in the 18th century. So I still want to eat this whole thing up, but I'm gonna have to save it. Other people might want to try this. So if you want more on, especially custards, 18th century custards, we've done several of them, but this one is really fun. This is a fried custard. I'll see you over there.